On a warm summer morning in Frederick, Colorado, August 13, 2018, the picturesque neighborhood woke to shocking news. Chris Watts, a quiet, clean-cut man who lived with his wife, Shanann, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, reported his family missing. That day, with a calm, almost distant tone, Chris stood in front of TV cameras pleading for their safe return. He described his daughters, 4-year-old Bella, who was shy and sweet, and 3-year-old Celeste, who was full of energy, hoping someone would bring them home. To the public, Chris appeared to be a heartbroken husband and father, desperate to reunite with his family. But to the investigators and those closest to the case, something felt off. His demeanor seemed too calm, too composed. He wasn't showing the raw panic or heartbreak one would expect from a man whose pregnant wife and young children had seemingly vanished without a trace. Yet as neighbors and friends watched in sympathy, few could have imagined the dark, unspeakable secret Chris was harboring beneath his placid exterior. Shanann Watts, at 34 years old, was a vibrant, outgoing woman who shared much of her life online. A self-proclaimed health advocate and an active user of social media, she regularly posted updates about her family, her career, and her love for Chris. She was pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. Shanann's online posts painted a picture of an idyllic family life. She frequently praised Chris for being a wonderful husband and father. They seemed like the perfect family, beautiful children, a home in the suburbs, and a baby on the way. But as Shanann's life played out on social media, behind the scenes, their reality was far more complex. Financial troubles had plagued the Watts family for years. Chris and Shanann had declared bankruptcy in 2015 after struggling to keep up with their mounting debts. Despite these challenges, Shanann was determined to provide the best life for her children. She worked hard as a marketing representative for a health and wellness company, traveling frequently for business. Her optimism was infectious, but it couldn't mask the growing tension within her marriage. What Shanann didn't know, however, was that Chris had begun an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, just weeks before the murders. Chris had grown distant, seemingly detached from the family that once brought him joy. And soon the pressures of his double life would reach a terrifying breaking point. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a work trip to Arizona. Her friend and colleague had dropped her off, and everything seemed fine. But later that morning, when Shanann failed to show up for a scheduled doctor's appointment, concern quickly spread. She was 15 weeks pregnant, and missing a checkup was out of character for the normally punctual Shanann. Her friend grew increasingly worried when she couldn't reach her by phone or text. She called the police, and soon officers were at the Watts home conducting a welfare check. What they found inside the house raised immediate concerns. Shanann's car was still in the garage. Her purse, phone, and keys were inside the home, yet there was no sign of her or the children. The scene was eerie. It was as if Shanann had simply vanished into thin air. Chris, who had left for work early that morning, returned to meet the police. He appeared cooperative, though oddly calm. He explained that he and Shanann had argued before he left for work, discussing the possibility of separating, but nothing seemed particularly alarming. As investigators combed through the house and neighborhood for clues, they noted Chris's strange behavior. He wasn't showing the kind of distress expected from a husband and father whose entire family was missing. The neighbors, too, found his demeanor unsettling. One even showed police footage from a security camera that captured Chris loading his truck the morning of the disappearance. It appeared he was moving something large into the vehicle, a detail that would later become crucial to solving the case. 2 days after the disappearance, with mounting pressure and suspicion growing around Chris, he was brought in for questioning. Detectives administered a polygraph test, which Chris failed. It was clear he wasn't telling the full truth. Cornered by the evidence and his failure to maintain his lies, Chris made a shocking confession. But it wasn't the whole story. He claimed that after telling Shanann about his affair, she flew into a rage and strangled their daughters in retaliation. In response, he said, he strangled her in a moment of blind fury. It was a story riddled with inconsistencies, and investigators didn't believe it for a second. Soon after, the full truth would emerge, revealing the horrific events of that morning. In reality, Chris had made a calculated decision to end not just his marriage, but his entire family. After Shanann returned home from her trip, Chris was no longer the man she thought she knew. He was consumed by his affair with Nicole Kessinger and had decided to start a new life without his wife and children. In the early hours of August 13th, Chris strangled Shanann in their bed. His pregnant wife, who had loved him so deeply, was now just an obstacle in the way of his new beginning. But Chris's monstrous actions didn't stop there. After killing Shanann, he coldly turned his attention to his two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, who were still asleep in their rooms. One by one, he smothered them, placing their tiny bodies into the back of his truck along with Shanann's. The most chilling part was that Bella, the older of the two, fought for her life. According to later testimony, she had visible defensive wounds, a testament to her last moments of terror and confusion as her own father took her life. With the bodies of his wife and daughters loaded in the truck, Chris drove to a remote oil work site owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. There, in an act of cold-hearted precision, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave. Then he opened two massive oil tanks and dropped Bella and Celeste's bodies inside. The sight of those tanks, where his daughters were abandoned, hidden away, remains one of the most haunting details of the case. Chris then drove home, hoping to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the walls of Chris's deception were closing in. Investigators were uncovering more and more contradictions in his story, and by August 15th, just 2 days after the family was reported missing, he was arrested. Chris's attempt to erase his family and begin anew with Nicole Kessinger unraveled rapidly under the weight of evidence. The police recovered the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. The nation, gripped by the details of the case, watched in horror as this once quiet, seemingly loving father turned out to be a cold-blooded killer. Public outrage swelled, and the world struggled to understand how a father could commit such unthinkable acts. Shanann's social media presence painted a perfect family life, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of her final days. The facade Chris had maintained for so long crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. His affair, which had remained hidden from Shanann, became a key focus as the story unfolded, adding another layer of betrayal to the tragedy. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty, a decision supported by Shanann's family. They didn't want more death. They wanted to ensure Chris spent the rest of his life reflecting on the monstrous acts he had committed. At his sentencing, Shanann's family confronted him, expressing their unimaginable grief and anger. Chris sat silent, emotionless, offering no apology, no explanation. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with 84 additional years for tampering with evidence and the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy. As Chris was led away to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, the world was left to grapple with the haunting question: why? How could a man who appeared to be a loving husband and father carry out such a heinous crime? The case remains one of the most chilling family murder stories in modern history. It has been the subject of documentaries, books, and countless media discussions, as people try to comprehend the depths of Chris Watts's betrayal. The Watts family murders stand as a tragic reminder of how deception and darkness can lurk behind the most ordinary of appearances. The images of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, once smiling and full of life, are now frozen in time, forever linked to the unfathomable betrayal of a father who should have protected them. Chris Watts will live out his days in prison, but the legacy of his crimes will linger, a symbol of the capacity for evil to hide in plain sight, waiting to strike when no one is watching.